In the early 1980s, South Korea was poised on the brink of a major transformation. The country had been rapidly modernizing since the Korean War, with ambitious leaders at the helm pushing for rapid industrialization and international recognition. When the International Olympic Committee awarded the 1988 Summer Olympics to Seoul, it was seen as the perfect opportunity to showcase the nation's progress and secure its place on the world stage. The Games would symbolize a new era of growth, prosperity, and global influence for South Korea. Seoul, the capital, had already seen tremendous changes in its landscape, with towering skyscrapers replacing old, dilapidated buildings, and bustling new highways cutting through once picturesque neighborhoods. This expansion, however, had a cost. As the city grew, so too did the population of those left behind, the homeless, the displaced, and the forgotten. Many of these individuals had lost their homes due to forced evictions as a result of urban development projects, while others were simply victims of South Korea's rapidly industrializing economy, unable to keep up with the fast-paced changes. The government, now with the eyes of the world set firmly on Seoul, saw these homeless people as a glaring problem. With the Olympics fast approaching, South Korea's leaders knew they had to make a lasting impression on the global community. Seoul had to look spotless, pristine, and modern, free from the visible signs of poverty and hardship that might taint the country's image. The Olympic Games were seen as the ultimate opportunity to secure international prestige, and the government was determined to avoid any distractions that could jeopardize the success of the event. Behind closed doors, high-level discussions began. The government couldn't afford to let the growing number of homeless people in Seoul become an obstacle to the Games. Authorities began considering drastic measures to remove these individuals from the streets and out of sight, away from the gaze of Olympic visitors. They needed a solution that would be swift and efficient, something that wouldn't cause a stir or draw public attention. In the midst of these plans, an unspoken agreement was made between government officials and construction developers working on the Olympic venues. The areas surrounding the stadiums, hotels, and other Olympic infrastructure would be cleared of any unwanted presence, and the homeless population would be swiftly removed. At first, it seemed like an innocuous measure, simply relocating the homeless to shelters or other parts of the city. But as time passed, the government's methods became more extreme and covert. By early 1988, the months leading up to the Games were filled with secretive operations. The authorities quietly began rounding up the homeless people, many of whom had lived in makeshift shelters, under bridges, or in abandoned buildings, only to be told that they were being relocated for their own safety. These individuals, often vulnerable and powerless, had no idea that they were being swept away for a far more sinister reason. In most cases, they were given no choice, no explanation, and no warning. As the days went by, rumors began to spread. Some whispered that the homeless were being taken to the outskirts of the city, while others claimed that they were being erased entirely. Yet no one dared to speak out, for fear of drawing attention to the quiet, shadowy activities taking place under the cover of the Olympic preparations. The government was determined to keep its dark secret hidden, as it focused all its energy on the upcoming Games. The world, it seemed, would never know the true cost of South Korea's Olympic dream. As the preparations for the 1988 Seoul Olympics continued at full speed, the South Korean government grew increasingly focused on ensuring that the Games would unfold without a hitch. The eyes of the world were on Seoul, and any sign of disruption, especially from the growing homeless population, had to be eradicated swiftly. The homeless were seen as an embarrassment, an eyesore in the pristine city that South Korea was eager to present to the global stage. Behind the scenes, the operation to remove these individuals began in earnest, with government officials taking increasingly drastic steps to ensure the streets were cleared before the Olympic Games opened. At first, it seemed like a typical government relocation effort. Teams of officials and social workers moved through the city, collecting the homeless and directing them to temporary shelters. But as time passed, the measures became more extreme and covert. As the international press descended upon the city, The government couldn't afford for anyone to notice the homeless population, even in temporary housing. Rumors began circulating that the authorities were not just relocating people but were instead using far more aggressive tactics to remove them from sight permanently. Individuals who were moved into temporary shelters began to disappear without a trace. It started with small groups of people, often those who had been living on the fringes of society for years. They were told they were being moved to more comfortable accommodations, or perhaps to far-flung areas of the country where they would be cared for. However, many who were taken away never returned. Families of the missing began to grow desperate as weeks passed, and no word came. Some managed to track down the shelters they had been promised, only to find empty buildings and silent officials unwilling to provide any answers. As the number of disappearances grew, people began to ask questions. However, any attempt to investigate the fate of the homeless was swiftly suppressed by the government. Local journalists were warned not to publish stories about the missing, and any public demonstrations demanding answers were quickly silenced. The Olympic Games had to remain the focal point of attention, and nothing least of all a growing scandal could be allowed to detract from its perfection. The disappearances were not limited to just a few individuals. By the time the opening ceremony was near, hundreds, even thousands had been removed from the streets of Seoul. Official reports were sparse, and the government remained tight-lipped, publicly declaring that the homeless were being relocated to more suitable living conditions. But behind closed doors, the authorities were taking extreme measures to ensure that the Games would proceed without a blemish. Construction sites surrounding Olympic venues became the focal point for the operation. The displaced individuals were secretly transported to these sites, where their presence was erased in the most final and irreversible ways. Official records were manipulated, and no trace was left behind. The authorities worked in the shadows, erasing not only the people but also any evidence that they had ever existed. Meanwhile, the Games continued to move forward, with the government putting up a front of progress, prosperity, and modernity for the visiting world. The global spotlight on Seoul only grew brighter as the Olympics approached, and the government's efforts to cover up the disappearances intensified. Despite mounting rumors and whispers of something darker happening behind the scenes, the Olympic preparations remained on track. The missing people were forgotten in the rush to ensure that Seoul's image remained untarnished, and the city would soon host the world's most prestigious sporting event. The true story of what was happening to the homeless population, however, was buried beneath the glitzy facade that South Korea was determined to present to the world. As the 1988 Seoul Olympics grew nearer, the sense of excitement and anticipation in the air was palpable. The international community eagerly awaited the opening ceremony, and the global media descended on the city, eager to cover the event. But beneath the glittering surface, there were those who began to question what had been happening in the shadows of the city. The whispers about the sudden disappearance of thousands of homeless individuals grew louder, but the government's grip on information remained tight. The families of the missing were the first to raise alarms. Many had lost loved ones in the months leading up to the Olympics and found themselves with no answers. Some had seen their relatives taken away by authorities in official vans, told they were being relocated to temporary housing. Others had simply disappeared from the streets without any trace. As the weeks passed, the stories of the missing began to form a pattern, and families grew more desperate. Yet, whenever they sought information, they were met with silence or empty promises of help. Local journalists who tried to report on the growing crisis were quickly silenced. Some were threatened, while others had their stories buried. The government understood the power of the media, and they couldn't afford any negative press just before the Games. The political climate at the time was tense, and the government was determined to maintain its control over the narrative. Press conferences, official statements, and reports from government officials all painted a picture of progress and prosperity, obscuring the growing crisis on the streets. Despite the censorship, a few brave reporters continued to dig deeper. They started to gather testimonies from people who had seen the disappearances firsthand. Workers on construction sites near Olympic venues began to talk, describing the late-night activities that had been taking place under the cover of darkness. Some spoke of trucks arriving at the construction sites, unloading groups of homeless individuals who were then quickly and quietly ushered into the depths of the work zones, never to be seen again. Other witnesses described strange activities at the shelters where the homeless were supposedly being relocated. They reported seeing official vehicles leave with groups of people, only to return without them. These accounts, however, were difficult to verify. The authorities were quick to clamp down on any information that might make its way to the public, even resorting to intimidation tactics to ensure that no one would speak out. Whistleblowers who dared to go public with their stories were quickly discredited, and their credibility was questioned. Many were forced to retract their statements, claiming they had misunderstood the events or had been misinformed. The government's control over the media and information created an atmosphere of fear, and the truth remained elusive. As the days passed, the number of missing people continued to grow, but the world's attention remained focused on the upcoming Olympic Games. The media coverage of the preparations painted a picture of a city bustling with excitement, a country on the verge of a new era of prosperity and global recognition. No one seemed willing to connect the dots, to question the thousands of people who had simply vanished in the weeks leading up to the event. The true nature of the disappearances was buried beneath layers of official statements, Olympic propaganda, and carefully curated images of Seoul's bright future. The government, with its heavy-handed tactics and relentless focus on the Games, ensured that the truth would remain hidden. But behind closed doors, the grim reality was unfolding, a reality that few dared to acknowledge, let alone confront. After the opening ceremony of the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the world marveled at the grandeur of the event. The streets of Seoul were alive with excitement, and the city appeared flawless, with state-of-the-art stadiums, impeccable infrastructure, and a sense of national pride in the air. South Korea seemed to have successfully overcome its past struggles. Yet behind the celebration and festivity, the sinister truth remained buried. The thousands of homeless people who had been erased were forgotten by the public, and the world moved on, swept up by the spectacle of the Games. As the years passed, the Olympics became a distant memory for most people, a symbol of South Korea's rapid modernization. The city had undergone a remarkable transformation, and Seoul was now seen as a shining example of economic success. Tourists flocked to the capital, businesses thrived, and the country's international reputation was at an all-time high. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. But for the families of the missing, the passage of time only deepened the pain and frustration. The question of what had happened to their loved ones lingered, unanswered, in the back of their minds. The government, eager to maintain the illusion of progress, continued to suppress any attempts to revisit the past. Officially, there had been no mass disappearances, no forced removals, no dark secret hidden beneath the gleaming surface of Seoul. The authorities insisted that the homeless had been relocated to better accommodations, and that the country's efforts to modernize were nothing but positive. The few who dared to question this narrative were silenced, either through threats or outright intimidation. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the first cracks began to appear in the government's carefully constructed facade. A small group of investigative journalists and human rights activists, driven by the stories of families who had never given up searching for answers, started to dig into the events surrounding the 1988 Olympics. What they uncovered was shocking. Leaked government documents revealed secret meetings and decisions that outlined the systematic removal of the homeless from Seoul's streets. These documents, which had been buried for years, provided the first concrete evidence that the disappearances had been part of a well-coordinated plan by the government. The journalists and activists who began to piece together the truth found themselves up against a wall of resistance. The government's power was still formidable, and those who tried to expose the dark history of the Olympics were met with hostility. However, the public's growing interest in the case, fueled by the increasing availability of information and the persistence of the families who had never given up hope, forced the authorities to confront their past. Despite efforts to keep the truth hidden, the story of the erased 4,000 began to gain traction. Documentaries, books, and news reports brought attention to the missing individuals, and survivors who had witnessed the disappearances began to speak out. These individuals, some of whom had narrowly escaped being swept up in the operation, told harrowing stories of how the homeless were taken from the streets and disposed of in the most horrifying ways. As the truth finally began to emerge, South Korea found itself grappling with the stain left by its past. The government, now facing mounting pressure, reluctantly acknowledged the existence of the cover-up, but even as they admitted to their role in erasing the homeless population, they insisted that the decision had been made in the best interests of the country and its future. The apology, however, rang hollow for those who had lost loved ones, for the families who had never received any closure. The government's acknowledgement of the tragedy did little to heal the wounds left by the forced disappearances. The families of the 4,000 still sought justice, and the city of Seoul was left to grapple with the consequences of its actions. The Olympics, once a symbol of South Korea's triumph, had cast a dark shadow over the country's history, and the memory of those who had been erased could never truly be forgotten. Though the world had moved on, the truth remained buried but never fully erased. Decades after the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the truth behind the forced disappearances of 4,000 homeless individuals began to resurface. The passage of time had not erased the dark legacy left by the government's actions. As information slowly leaked out, the implications of what had happened were far more complex and disturbing than anyone could have imagined at the time. The Olympic Games, which had been marketed as a celebration of South Korea's triumph, had come at an incalculable human cost. Yet, for the families who had lost loved ones, the memory of those erased remained ever present, haunting them as they searched for justice. The process of uncovering the full extent of the cover-up took many years. Despite initial efforts to suppress the truth, there was a growing body of research and investigative work that gradually revealed the scale of the operation. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, independent researchers, journalists, and activists began piecing together evidence that had long been hidden. Leaked government documents from the 1980s, along with testimonies from former officials and construction workers who had been involved, pointed to a coordinated effort by the South Korean government to eradicate the homeless population in time for the Olympic Games. What had initially seemed like a series of isolated disappearances was now recognized as a deliberate, large-scale operation designed to cleanse the city. The government's initial response was one of vehement denial. Officials clung to their narrative of progress and modernization, maintaining that the homeless had been relocated to better conditions. For years, they claimed that the disappearances were simply part of the city's urban renewal efforts. It wasn't until new evidence came to light, corroborated by independent investigations, that the truth began to unravel. The discovery of mass graves, hidden construction sites, and destroyed records pointed to a chilling reality. The homeless were not just relocated, they were systematically erased. The government's role in this cover-up could no longer be denied, but they continued to justify their actions as being for the greater good of the country. As the truth emerged, public outrage grew. The international community, which had once hailed South Korea's progress and success during the Olympics, began to reassess the cost of that achievement. Documentaries, books, and exposes revealed the gruesome details of the operation, and the families of the missing, many of whom had never stopped searching, finally found a platform to share their stories. These individuals, who had once been silenced, now had their voices heard. They spoke of the pain, the uncertainty, and the injustice of having loved ones taken without explanation or accountability. However, even as public awareness of the events grew, true justice remained elusive. The South Korean government, while acknowledging the mistakes of the past, failed to hold those responsible accountable. The apology issued by the authorities was seen by many as insufficient, a mere token gesture that did little to assuage the grief of the families or to atone for the horrors that had been inflicted. The government's reluctance to take full responsibility for the scale of the tragedy only deepened the wounds. Legal efforts to seek justice were met with resistance, and many of the perpetrators of the disappearances, if identified, remained beyond the reach of the law. In the years following the revelations, South Korea struggled to come to terms with its past. The Olympics, once a symbol of national pride, had become a reminder of the dark forces that had shaped the country's rapid rise to power. The memory of the erased homeless individuals, their lives extinguished in the name of progress, could never be fully erased. The scars left by the tragedy were woven into the fabric of the nation's history, a painful reminder that no amount of global acclaim or economic success could ever erase the human cost of the decisions made in the shadows. As time passed, the story of the 4,000 disappeared individuals became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the lengths to which those in power will go to protect their image. The Olympics had brought international prestige to South Korea, but it had also exposed the depths of its moral compromises. The truth about what had happened in Seoul would forever remain a stain on the country's legacy, a reminder of the cost of a dream built on the backs of those who were forgotten.